Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be looking at the vampires of the movie Dracula Untold. If you enjoy movies about vampires and werewolves, I cover a lot of them, so if you haven't, please subscribe and check out my other videos. The movie starts off with a bit of history. In the year of our Lord 1442, the Turkish enslaved 1,000 Transylvanian boys. They were beaten without mercy and trained to kill without a second thought. From these boys, one grew so fierce that entire armies would retreat in terror at the mention of his name. Vlad the Impaler, son of the dragon. Sickened by his monstrous acts, Vlad came to bury his past with the dead and returned to Transylvania to rule in peace, but he would come to be known by another name. In the beginning of the movie, Vlad finds a helmet in a stream that comes from Broken Tooth Mountain. On the mountain, he finds a cave which he thinks has Turkish scouts hiding inside it. While searching the cave, they realize the floor is covered in a strange material, and Vlad quickly realizes it's crushed bone. There's also skulls and some assorted items around the cave. Vlad realized quickly that this is not any Turkish scouts. Him and his men are then attacked by an unseen force in the dark cave. The other men are killed while trying to escape. Vlad manages to cut the creature with his sword before he's thrown to the ground. Vlad manages to reach the sun-filled doorway and the creature comes no further. When Vlad raises his sword into the sunlight, the blood disintegrates and disappears. This is where we get to see a vampire for the first time. I do have to say that I appreciate that this movie wastes no time getting to the good stuff. It's not a huge lead up until we get to see the first vampire. It pretty much happens right away. When Vlad returns from the cave, a holy man informs him that it's no coincidence that he encountered the creature. He says every brother in his order awoke from an identical dream. He says he would not have thought such a thing possible, but he suffered the same vision as well. A vision of a creature laying siege to this holy place. He shows what looks to be a diagram of a vampire, and he says Roman mystics prophesize the coming of great evil, a vampire. We see some close-ups of fangs and their elongated nails. According to the holy man, vampire comes from the Greek word pi, to drink. The beast was once a mortal man who summoned a demon from the depths of hell to trade for his dark power. The demon, however, tricked the man, granting his wish, but his price was an eternity condemned to the darkness of the cave, where he remains until he finds another to set him free. After Vlad decides he will not give the Sultans the 1,000 Transylvanian boys they want for an army, including Vlad's own son, he knows he will need some kind of help to defend his people. Desperate, he returns to the cave of the creature that nearly killed him. When Vlad returns to the cave, the vampire says, "You returned." No one has ever returned. This already sets Vlad aside from all the others the vampires come across in the cave. This creature flicks Vlad's sore away with a finger. He tells Vlad that usually men reek of fear, but in him he senses hope. Vlad possesses a silver ring, and the vampire says, "Your silver offends me, cloak it from my sight." And we see from the perspective of the vampire that the silver ring seems to give off an almost blinding bright light. Vlad says that he wants to defend his people, his family, and if he had the strength of the creature, he could do it. The vampire starts to explain that he was condemned to the cave by the one who turned him, which we already knew. But he says that he has been waiting in eternity for a man of Vlad's strength, his gifts, and his will. A man worthy of the dark and all its powers. He grabs the skull and smashes it and says, "For if I am your salvation, you are mine." The vampire bites his own wrist and lets the blood fill the broken skull cap and tells Vlad to drink. He says Vlad will have a taste of his power and the strength of 100 men, the speed of a falling star, dominion over the night and all its creatures, to see and hear through their senses, and even heal grievous wounds. To which Vlad asks, at what price? The vampire states that once he drinks, his thirst for human blood will be insatiable. But if he can resist for 3 days, he will return to his normal state, having sampled his power and perhaps saved his people. And then Vlad asks, "And if I feed?" To which the vampire replies, "The price would be worse than if you had never stepped in the cave, because he will be set free, having granted the darkness a worthy offering. Vlad will become a vessel as he is, a scourge on the earth, destined to destroy everything you hold dear." It's interesting to note that the vampire master says, "You will have a taste of my power and the strength of 100 men," and so on. So he doesn't necessarily think of his strength and speed as part of his power. When he says his power, he might literally mean like supernatural powers, like when Vlad changes the weather or makes cloud cover or then clears the clouds later. The only other specific instance I could think of supernatural powers is maybe when he turns himself into like a swarm of bats and kills people. But because the original vampire says a taste of my power, we can still safely assume that the original vampire is probably still much stronger than Vlad. The vampire says that he wants to be free so he can unleash his wrath against the one who betrayed him. this probably being the demon who tricked him. And one day, he will call on Vlad to serve him, his pawn, in an immortal game of revenge. When Vlad drinks the blood, the master vampire seems to feel something, as he seems to look away and show some small reaction, possibly the establishment of their connection. When Vlad drinks the vampire blood, he asks, "What now?" And the vampire says, "You die." So you must have to die to become a vessel for the darkness. Vlad then awakens by the riverside after having some flashbacks and visions of the vampire. One of the visions seems to be himself about to bite someone. The vampire that gave Vlad his blood seems to be the first and only of the vampires, as he is referred to as the master vampire. Unless the demon they refer to as tricking him was in fact another vampire, but the holy man describes the event as a demon was summoned from hell, so I think the creature in the cave is the first vampire, and Vlad being the first suitable candidate for the darkness, he is now becoming the second. I think the only way there could have been previous vampires was if possibly a vampire existed before this master vampire and was slain, and then this new vampire became the new master vampire, which is possible. Vlad has some pretty amazing abilities. At this point he is not a vampire because he has not been fully turned, only given a sample of the original creature's powers. Even still, he is immensely powerful. His abilities before and after he becomes a full vampire seem to be identical, other than when he has the power to darken and remove the darkness from the sky, allowing him to travel at will in the daylight. Although I assume he received a strength buff when he consumed blood for the first time, finalizing his transformation. When Vlad first awakens with the powers of a vampire, he notices his silver ring is burning his skin, so he takes it off immediately. He places his hand on a rock to stand and crushes the stone with his bare hand, showing he has immense strength. He receives a small cut on his hand when he crushes the rock, but it heals completely right in front of his eyes. He is able to hear a spider wrapping some prey in a web from several meters away. He's then shown being able to see in some kind of special vision, probably seeing through the senses of other animals like the master vampire said he could. It looks similar to a thermal vision as the creatures are highlighted. He then looks up into the sky, revealing the Milky Way through the clouds. This possibly due to him being able to see at night so he can maybe see other spectrums of light. Not too sure about that one. He can run extremely fast, but also possesses the ability to travel even faster in the form of a small swarm of bats. Although he mostly uses this for fast travel or teleportation-like ability while fighting, he can in fact kill in this form, and quite easily. Vlad is so strong that he is able to defeat 1,000 soldiers by himself with no trouble at all. We know the master vampire has been alive for a very long time and is seemingly not aged at all, so these vampires are immortal and completely immune to aging. The vampires in this movie are I guess what you would consider traditional vampires, in the sense that they seem to be weak to silver, crosses, sunlight, and stakes through the heart. We never see it, but presumably they're also weak to garlic and holy water. These vampires are definitely classic vampires that stray away from the biological disease kind of vampires. These are 100% cursed beings with supernatural powers. When the holy man uses a cross to keep the vampires back, we momentarily see the cross through Vlad's vision, and the cross burns a bright red and causes the vampires to retreat back in pain, and they can't even gaze upon it, covering their eyes. When Vlad feeds on blood, he seems to slightly transform into a more beast-like form, and his eyes change as well. So Vlad may possess another form altogether if he were to feed on enough blood or become enraged enough. Another bit of evidence that lends itself to this is that later in the movie when Vlad goes to attack someone, his hand transforms into a hand similar to the vampires we see depicted in the Holy Man's books, so Vlad could possibly take this form completely if he wanted to. The Master Vampire is also shown being able to open his mouth extremely wide and has a very large tongue, so they might be able to manipulate their physical form at will to a certain degree. And although all the other vampires we see are completely blood hungry and kill everyone in sight, Vlad is able to control himself around his family and his people and never attacks anyone. This is a good example of how his willpower is stronger than most, and would probably made him a good offering to the darkness. When Vlad is fighting while standing on top of silver coins, his strength and speed are seemingly reduced to an almost human level, but he does still retain some of his abilities. The man he is fighting asks him, "How long will you be able to bear it in here? You grow more wary by the moment." So the presence of such a large amount of silver also slowly weakens him, where eventually he might become completely incapacitated. Also, when someone tries to stake him, his armor seems to disintegrate away from the tip of the stake, so seemingly a vampire could be staked even while wearing heavy armor. This possibly being part of the supernatural curse. Vlad is seemingly killed by sunlight, but is brought back to life by only a small amount of blood, So these vampires can go into a sleep or suspended animation if gravely damaged until their body can heal. As the master vampire said before, Vlad will have dominion over the night and all of its creatures. Vlad is only shown controlling bats in the movie, but presumably there are other creatures of the night, possibly wolves. He can summon bats to him and command them to do whatever he wants. Kill people, bring him a coke, well, maybe not that. He summons thousands of bats during a battle and unleash them on the Turkish army like a tidal wave. Men are thrown and likely killed by the sheer weight and numbers of bats slamming into them, and the others are shown being bitten and attacked by multiple bats. One of my favorite things he does with the bats is when he makes them form into a giant fist and he punches the ground and it causes like a giant shock wave. That was probably one of my favorite scenes of the movie. After he does that though, it actually shows a lot of the soldiers getting back to their feet. But if that many bats slammed into a bunch of people, they'd probably be squashed like a bug. I mean, there's got to be like a few tons of bats there at least. I also wanted to mention that in a deleted scene, Vlad makes eye-to-eye contact with Ishmael and commands him to kill someone. And despite knowing the risk to his life, he is compelled to attack. So Vlad also possesses the ability to manipulate people, coerce them, and order humans to obey him, almost like a mind control. At one point, Vlad is in the tent with his wife, and she notices all the scars he had from being whipped as a child have all mysteriously disappeared. So not only do your new wounds heal, but any kind of previous wound or ailment will also be completely healed when you become a vampire. He exposes himself to the sunlight briefly, and it causes his skin to turn to an almost ash and begins to float away. This is definitely a different effect than a lot that I've seen, but it's pretty interesting. In this movie, it seems like the way that vampires turn others is by giving them some of their blood. These vampires cannot turn people by biting them. They bite only to feed. When Vlad received blood from the master, he hears his voice in his head while having cravings for blood. This possibly alluding to the idea that they are connected. So if you sire a new vampire, you then might have a connection with them. Although we never see this come into play when Vlad turns the other vampires, so it could be something unique to the master vampire. When Vlad is around other people eating, and when he's around some blood that gets spilled on the ground, his bloodlust begins to take over. He becomes fascinated with the blood and begins to hear the master vampire talking in his head saying things like, "Fulfill your destiny, set me free." And you can hear other voices of people whispering. There's a woman and even some people chanting. This is probably the master vampire playing tricks on Vlad's mind. He would no doubt have the urge to drink blood, but I think the master vampire makes this worse by whispering in his ear, trying to persuade him, because of course the master vampire has quite a lot to gain if Vlad loses control. We see the master vampire later, and he appears to look totally normal again, as opposed to how he looked in the cave. This possibly due to him being able to consume blood more frequently, or being free of the curse that kept him in the cave had something to do with his appearance. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. I have to say, Dracula Untold is probably one of my favorite renditions of the classic Dracula story. Also, if you didn't notice, the actor that plays the master vampire also plays Thomas from the Underworld series. I find it funny how a lot of these actors in vampire movies also appear as vampires in other movies, like how Lucian the head Lycan from Underworld also appears as one of the head vampires in Twilight. Anyway, if you guys have any other suggestions for movies you want me to make videos about, please leave them in the comments. I'm still going to be making the video on Priest. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like, and if you haven't, please subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.